What is shaping logistics in 2022? Well, three areas I'm going to look at. First of all, supply chain chaos. Secondly, the new normal, whenever and whatever that may be, and how the logistics industry is booming. First of all, supply chain chaos. No question, we've seen massive disruption to supply chains. The vulnerabilities and interdependencies in over-globalized supply chains have been brutally exposed by this COVID pandemic. We ended up in a total disequilibrium in the supply chain. We had way not enough supply and we had way too much demand. And this resulted in supply chains becoming disrupted, clogged up, congested, and record high costs for moving products around the world. Many of us will have capitalized on those high freight rates. So we ended up in this supply chain COVID-induced gridlock, where we had tens, sometimes hundreds of container ships parked at anchor outside major container ports, waiting to come in and berth, to discharge cargo and collect cargo. On the air freight sector, as passenger planes were removed from the system because nobody was traveling, airlines resorted to flying passenger planes without passengers, but putting cargo, strapping cargo into the seats of the plane. And then later on, many of them removed all the passenger seats in order to fly cargo on the whole passenger deck. The ramifications of this congestion and supply chain chaos filtered through to the warehousing sector, where we had overloaded warehouses, both at origin of destination, of product that was unable to move because of transport gridlocks, and in many cases, because of orders being cancelled initially when demand had slumped. And then the fourth area of the supply chain gridlock as it relates to logistics was, of course, in the trucking sector. We had border closures, we had drivers getting sick that couldn't go to work, and we had restrictions on where the truckers could travel and where the lorries could travel. This exacerbated a driver shortage crisis. Predominantly in the first world, truck driver shortages is a big issue. In the European Union, the driver shortage at the end of last year was more than 320,000 truck driver vacancies that companies are unable to fill. In the US, it was 80,000. So what I want to talk about is how the logistics fraternity kept the global economy moving through this crisis. Could I invite you all to stand up, please? Could you all please stand up and give ourselves a round of applause? The logistics and freight fraternity kept the global economy going through this crisis. And we are now the heroes. Everybody's talking logistics, supply chain, and freight, right? Even the bankers talk about supply chain these days. Thank you. Round of applause for you, and gratitude, attitude for everybody involved in keeping goods moving through this crisis. So, we've also got trade tensions ongoing. To the surprise of many, the US-China poor relations, for want of a better word, continued under Joe Biden. A lot of people expected it to soften. In some ways, it's actually hardened. And despite this, we had the COVID bounce back of a surge in demand as people were shopping online for goods to be delivered to their home that they could use at home because they were unable to go out and take advantage of their disposable income in the services sector. So people couldn't go to football games, they couldn't go to the cinema, they couldn't go to school, they couldn't go to work. So everything had to be done at home. So there was this gorging of online shopping that had this bonanza surge of imports into the US. This resulted in massive port congestion and extended transit times. So transit times pretty much almost doubled as prices quadrupled. On top of that, we've got this recent crisis, which from a humanitarian perspective is absolutely disastrous. But I need to focus on the business issues. And the business issues are this, that with this crisis in Ukraine and between Russia, we have transport blockages, supply constraints, severe sanctions, I should add, predominantly led by the West, And these trade routes have become blocked up. This chart shows in blue those that have joined this group that have applied these severe sanctions. Right now, today, there are 4.5 million tons of grain in Ukraine waiting to be exported that can't get out to their export markets. The Black Sea ports are effectively closed. The airspace over that region of the world is effectively closed. Russia is also a major exporter of wheat, and the two countries between them export some pretty significant minerals. So we're going to see ramifications of these sanctions and transit blockages come through, filtering through, certainly in the food supply chain in terms of increased cost and shortage of availability, but also in other related supply chains that we may not necessarily be aware of yet. As the container shipping sector had become very congested and slow, many containers from Europe to Asia had been shifted onto the old Silk Rail route. More than 1 million additional containers in 2021 travelled on the rail from China to Europe than in the previous years. Now, most of those routes go through Russia, so those routes are now closed. So there's 1 million extra containers that are trying to get back on ships. But all the ships are full, as you well know, and every ship that's available to be put into service is in service. So we're going to have further congestion compounding the COVID crisis from this crisis here. Also, in the last couple of months, we've been exposed to the China severe strategy about locking down even major cities as a result of a relatively few number of COVID cases. This is the Bund in Shanghai. Many of you will recognize this. Shanghai, a city of over 23 million people, was in lockdown for the best part of a month because they had a few hundred COVID cases. As you all would know, Shanghai is the world's biggest container port. Now, the port was still operating, but people couldn't get to and from the port from the main city. So there was an accumulation of containers at the port. They ran out of reefer points, so the reefer containers had to stay on the ship because there was nowhere to plug them in, and they couldn't discharge the containers from the yard to get them into domestic circulation. So this has been a big issue. The left-hand chart here shows just at the 28th of April, just 2 weeks ago, the number of ships waiting to berth in Shanghai. The green ones are cargo ships, so container ships. Massive logjam there as a result of this dynamic zero COVID policy. And this is now filtering through into investor concerns as well as the supply concerns from the investment community about the medium-term viability as Shanghai as the China generally, but Shanghai specifically as the manufacturing center of the world. The PMI chart on the right-hand side is the Purchasing Managers Index that many economies measure. Generally speaking, a score above 50 indicates growth, and a score below 50 indicates contraction. And you can see where it has been in the early part of 2022. So question marks around the viability as China as the hub of your global supply chains. And this is now filtering into Wall Street. The chief executive officers in a recent survey by AlixPartners, 69% of them were worried about their supply chain. Now, those people probably 3 years ago never even thought about their supply chain, because when the supply chain's working, there's no glory. It's expected. It's only when the supply chain's not working that people take notice. So from Wall Street to global supply chains to dynamic COVID zero lockdowns to the Ukraine crisis, this is a messy situation. And I believe this is, what's happened in the last couple of years, is another nail in the coffin of globalization. Because I believe that over the last 30 years, we have over-globalized our supply chains. So let's think about the new normal. So what is the new normal going to be? Well, obviously, there are going to be economic challenges. I think there'll be an element of global decoupling. And of course, supply chain resilience is now top of the agenda for many, many companies. On the economic challenges front, the IMF just recently, a couple of weeks ago, reduced their growth forecast for almost all of the top 8 economies in the world. Only Japan and India did they increase their forecast. All the others, as you can see in the chart, they reduced their growth forecast for 2022. So in some ways, we might think we're out of the crisis, but we're nowhere near out of the woods just yet. Particularly exacerbated by what's going on in Russia and the related sanctions, the ramifications there are coming through to oil prices and therefore fuel costs. Now, every consumer good, every industrial good has to be transported. Transport, as we all know, is dependent on fuel. So as fuel prices rise, everything is going to rise, not just the cost of transport, but the cost of goods as they move through the supply chain. This is then going to lead into inflation. We're going to have food supply chain disruption because of the grain and the wheat that can't get out of Russia and Ukraine. But generally speaking, there's going to be increasing inflation. You can see here over the last 6 months where that's going. So it's a challenging time ahead in this new normal. Will there be a global decoupling? I don't think it'll be quite a bifurcation into East and West, but I think there will be an element of decoupling. One chart that I found published by the Asia Briefing content platform splits it quite severely into effectively the West and the rest, the blue and the red, and South America, and I think New Zealand being combined interests. I don't think it'll be quite as severe as that, but there's definitely going to be some decoupling, particularly as it relates to global supply chains. In the Asia region, which is where I've been based for the best part of 25 years, we have the competing for the attention, the US and China competing for attention. This chart here from the New York Times identifies those countries in red who are shifting towards China, the countries in blue who are trying to resist China and counteract that, and therefore have their allegiance to the US. And the countries in green, which is most of them, are playing this difficult challenge of trying to play both sides. Nobody wants to alienate China, and nobody wants to alienate the US. So it's a difficult balancing game for some of these relatively smaller economies. Now, China's reach around the world over the last 10 years through its Belt and Road Initiative, with some question marks about the transparency and the debt situations, but its reach around the world through the Belt and Road is now more than 130 countries have some element of Belt and Road Initiative in terms of investment in infrastructure. This is roads, tunnels, highways, motorways, ports, airports, telecommunications infrastructure, dams, all these sort of major projects, infrastructure projects, that the Belt and Road Initiative is designed to help fund, build, and operate. More than $4 trillion has been committed in the last 10 years since the initiative was mentioned. So from the supply chain resilience perspective, companies now have, as I alluded to a minute ago, their CEOs are focused on supply chain. Supply chain resilience is at top of the agenda. And supply chain resilience is dependent on these 5 key things: agility, velocity, visibility, flexibility, and collaboration. And resilience in this context is the ability to bounce back from adversity. We can think of that in our personal lives as well as our business lives. So what's going to happen in these discussions is that the subject of the relocation of production, these discussions are going to resurface once again in the context of building more resilience into the supply chain. And now more than ever, I think this is going to be a reality: reshoring and nearshoring. So reshoring is moving it all the way back, also known as onshoring, so that would take manufacturing out of China and put it back in America. Nearshoring is taking it, moving it closer to, so that could be, in the United States case, Mexico is the key beneficiary of a nearshoring strategy. In Europe, places like Hungary, Poland would be key beneficiaries in a nearshoring strategy. Now, when we talk about reshoring, we always get concerned about labour, the cost and the availability thereof. And many reshoring initiatives in the past have stumbled because the labour is just prohibitively expensive in the first world markets. However, what's important to note is that since we've been on this globalization journey for the last 30 years, the cost of labor, even in the developing and emerging markets, has more than doubled, while the cost of robotics has more than halved. So now it's a different financial model that we're looking at if we think about automation of production in a high labor cost market. The cost of physical labor versus a robot, according to this study by McKinsey and the EIU, in the United States, it's six times more expensive to deploy people than it is to deploy robots. We're talking about manufacturing operations. And in Germany, that's 9 times as much to use people. And of course, factored into that is robots. They don't need toilet breaks, they don't need tea breaks, they don't need annual leave, they don't need paternity or maternity leave, they don't get sick, and they can work around the clock. So I think what we're going to see is helping this element of reshoring that companies have become concerned about their supply chain ecosystems being too global and too vulnerable. Helping that is going to be wider spread adoption of robotics in production in first world markets. And a lot of these solutions now are available on a service basis. You don't have to buy all the robotic systems up front and have a whole team of hardware and software engineers to service it. You just pay a service contract, and they come and install it, and you pay a monthly fee, a pay-as-you-use service for robotics and automation. So the entry level is reduced, the barriers to entry are reduced. So I think the future workforce in Europe and the United States will look like my friends here. And I can see cheap labor being replaced by chip labor. Excuse the pun. So what would this mean for China then, if people start moving their manufacturing out of China? Well, it's not all going to move, obviously, because the rest of the world couldn't absorb that much actual manufacturing. China remains the giant and still will be for many years to come. But there will be some diversification. Gartner, in their survey, said that 33% of their clients that they talked to were going to move, or were planning to move their production, some of it, not all of it, some of it by 2023. Well, that's just next year. So when it comes to China's supply chain as part of your global supply chain, there are three strategies now to look at. One is called the China Plus strategy, and this was given a turbocharge during the trade tariffs initiated by Donald Trump, because all exports from China into the US got whacked with these tariffs. So what a lot of companies did was move the production out of China and just pop it down the road somewhere else. Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Bangladesh, Indonesia all took some of this overload of what was China manufactured product destined for the US to become made in Thailand, go to the US, made in Vietnam, go to the US, and therefore avoid the tariffs. A lot of those movement, by the way, was Chinese factories setting up additional factories. So that's the China Plus. The second strategy, as I've just said, is the reshoring or nearshoring. That's to pick it up out of Asia and take it either closer to home or back home. So what about the stuff that's sold in China? Well, the third strategy for China in your global supply chain is called the in China for China. So whatever you are selling in China, you continue to make in China. It doesn't really make any sense to move that outside of China. In fact, it would be detrimental to your business to do so. So we make in China for what we sell in China. For what we were making in China that we were exporting, we either move it nearer or closer to home or pop it somewhere else around the Asia region. So over these next 5 years, we'll see a lot of change in the whole supply chain agenda. And these new supply chains, the next generation of supply chains, will become much more regional. And if they're regional, then therefore they are shorter. The distances are obviously shorter. And this, for companies, will benefit them by reducing their lead times, reducing their freight costs, and of course reducing emissions, which everybody should be caring about, and in fact does. At the same time, it will increase their control over the supply chain, their responsiveness to local market demand, because they can respond faster because the supply chain is shorter, and increase their resilience, which is what we're trying to do. So that's what I think the next normal will look like. The logistics sector, some key dynamics to touch on here. It's booming. Is everybody booming? Has everybody got a lot of cargo at high rates? No? Yeah. Are we making good money in the last couple of years? I think so. I think so. Okay, so we're having boom times. A boom time is having a period of great prosperity or rapid economic growth, and I think that's what we're in. Freight rates on the ocean side have more or less quadrupled. Now, that's not that good for our customers, but as freight forwarders and logistics providers, that has to be good for us, because we can't control the rates. We still have to find the best rate for the customer, but the level is a lot higher than it was before, right? So our revenues obviously have to go up, and hopefully our margins continue to be maintained. So freight rates have quadrupled. At the same time, it's difficult to get space, and we've still got congestion in the system. The overall container shipping capacity due just to congestion is reduced by 12 to 15%. So the ships that are congested is effectively taking out of the system 12 to 15% of the global capacity. That's according to Maersk. So the freight rates have quadrupled, the transit times have doubled. That's good for us. But think about if you're a CEO of a multinational business, and this is all part of your global supply chains, why would you not be thinking about reconfiguring your supply chain to avoid some of this chaos? Because this is going to continue through this year. It's not going to be finished and all over by the end of this year, because it's had a further impetus into the chaos from the Ukraine crisis. And we're going to have inflation. But it's boom times for the logistics sector. Here's the global freight forwarding market projection. You can see the history over the year going back to 2011. So in 2021, after a slump in 2020, there was a big bounce back, 11% growth, which took it to a $284 billion sector. This is freight forwarding revenues. This is what you all participate in this sector. Now, for this year, the projection is a more modest but still robust growth of 5.7% to take it to a $298 billion sector by the end of this year. And I don't know about you guys, hopefully you've all had record profits and record revenues, but these guys, the top five, or a selection of top five, between them last year had 28 billion euros additional freight forwarding revenue, additional, over and above the previous year. And you can see the growth of figures here. And we're seeing in the earnings reports that's rippling through into their profitability numbers. So the growth outlook for sea freight and air freight, obviously sea freight is our focus today. That's the right-hand side of the chart. So it was 6.6% last year. That took it to the almost 150 billion euro, and 5% for next year. So we're still talking about, for this year, sorry. We're still talking about robust growth in the sea freight forwarding market. Now, during this time, of course, the shipping lines have been gorging on their profitability and their revenue. Look at these numbers. $200 billion of profit as a container shipping line sector in 2021, and projected another 300 billion this year. What a nice place to be. Now, we must admit that the shipping lines have had some tough times over the years, but this is their glory time, right? They are raking it in. And what are they going to do with that money? Well, I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Interesting how the container shipping sector made record profits as a segment of $200 billion in the same period that the airline sector made total losses as a sector of $150 billion. So it wasn't a good time to be an airline, but it was a great time to be a shipping line. And what are they going to do with this cash? Well, a lot of them are ordering more ships. Of course, that's what shipping lines do when you've got cash. You order more ships. But chips take about 3 years to come. So I'm not sure what the demand is going to look like in 3 years from now, and whether things might have settled down a bit, whether there'll still be enough demand for those new ships to be utilized. So we might end up in this cycle that we've seen in the systemically dysfunctional sector of shipping line ownership. But what they are doing with their cash, and the port terminal operators, is they're trying to get a bigger piece of the pie. As logistics has become sexy through this crisis, because that is what's helped the global economy continue to function, and logistics is profitable, then other people want to get a slice. So what we've seen is shipping lines splashing the cash on acquiring logistics companies. We've also seen port terminal operators splash their cash on buying logistics companies. This extends their reach across the supply chain, so they get their arms around more of the total supply chain. And in this sort of scenario, the big guys are going to continue to get bigger, a bit like I did during COVID when I couldn't go out. So the strategy is you need to get bought as a mid-sized company, get bought, get niche, which a lot of you are, or get out. So this is some of the consolidations that have happened, some of the big deals that have happened just in the last 24 months of who's buying who. So we've got container terminal operators, PSA and DP World, and most of these deals are billion-dollar-plus deals. So DP World, I know, paid more than $1 billion for Syncreon. They paid more than $1 billion for Imperial. Maersk is paying $3.7 billion for Lianfeng Logistics. Maersk, as we know, started its own air cargo, chartering planes to fly under the Maersk brand. MSC paid more than $1 billion for Bolloré, which is a leading African logistics company. MSC and Lufthansa together are looking to do a deal to buy out Alitalia. So a shipping line partnering with an airline to buy another airline. Who would have thought of that? And then we got CMA CGM, two big acquisitions, Jeffco and Ingram Micro. Shunfeng, the Chinese express player, buying Kerry Logistics. That's another multi-billion-dollar deal. DSV and Agility Contract Logistics. DHL and Hillebrand. So the one that has a for sale, an invisible for sale sign, you can't see it, but everybody knows it, is DB Schenker. And the question mark is, who will buy them? And it's got to be somebody with some deep pockets, and I'm sure the German government will be glad of some income if they can offload it. On the right-hand side, XPO divested, so they divested their contract logistics business, called it GXO, and that business in itself is a multi-billion-dollar business. Kuehne+Nagel increased their shareholding in Lufthansa. They're now the second largest shareholder in Lufthansa. And then we've got logistics forwarders chartering planes, DAXA specifically. And then we've got BCOs chartering ships. Lidl, IKEA, and Walmart have all chartered their own ships during this crisis, as has FedEx. Strange to see FedEx running a ship. So this is the new next normal. So the industry is booming and everybody wants a bigger piece of the pie. So in conclusion, what do I think about the supply chain outlook? Well, I think from a supply chain perspective and from a business ownership perspective and from a BCO perspective, it's more of the same. It's going to get worse before it gets better. There are more stormy seas ahead. What's the outlook for the logistics and freight fraternity? I think these boom times that we're enjoying are going to continue, at least through until next year and maybe longer. And the traditional strengths that the SME forwarder community has, which is your reputation, your knowledge, and your networks, will endure through this crisis and enable you to capitalize on this latest boom. So I would say to you, while the times are good, please enjoy riding the wave. Thank you.